No mai, haere mai, welcome. Ina mana, ina iwi, ina reo, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. E rau rangatira mā, e huhui mai nei. I ki te tautoko te kaupapa o te rā, he mihi nui, tēnā kia koutou. Thank you and welcome everybody to our seminar this morning with Professor Jan Rotmans from the Netherlands. Very privileged to have Professor Rotmans join us. He was very inspiring to me when we first started our work on the Taranaki 2050 roadmap, and his work is actually why our roadmap is called a roadmap, because I read some of his work and some of his concepts were a really great way for me in terms of guiding some of our work around the Taranaki 2050 roadmap. We'll start with our karakia, and then I've got a short presentation just to bring people up to speed before we hand over to Professor Rotmans. Okay, sorry, is this on? It's on. There we go, use that, yeah. Please feel free to join in with our karakia. Ko ranginui e tu e honei, ko papa tua nuku e tā kotua ake nei. Ara hina mai mātou, e roto i o korua, korowai aroha. Mō ake tonu, ti hei mauri ora. E tupu auraro i te mara o Taranaki maunga, ko namutu te kāinga, ko Ngāti Tiriti a hau, ko Gillian te tupuna, ko Gillian ko Miller, ko Blacklock nā whānau, ko te tumu whakarai te puna umanga, ko Justin Gillian taku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Justin Gillian, the Chief Executive of Venture Taranaki, and thank you all for coming this morning, and thank you to those of us who are joining us online. So we are screening this as a webinar, as well as obviously beaming in Professor Rotmans. We're very grateful to him joining for us. I think it's about 11 PM for him over there. So thank you, Jan, for staying up late to join us. A little bit about Taranaki. So we've got approximately 125,000 people with 8 iwi, 7 settled, and the last iwi nearly nearing settlement. And Pananinihi ki Waitotara is obviously a very important Māori-owned entity within our region. We've got approximately 16,000 businesses, and we have the highest GDP per capita in New Zealand, although our average household income is about 20% less than the New Zealand average. And our region is made up of a range of industries. Food and fibre, energy, engineering, tourism, health and construction are really the main aspects of our economy. Underneath the surface though, beneath that high GDP per capita, we do have a higher NEETs rate, which is youth who are not in education, employment or training. We have proportionally more skill leavers without NCEA 3. We have some appalling child poverty outcomes in our region. And for Māori and Taranaki, all of those outcomes are proportionately worse. So these are some of the challenges that we face and that we want to address through our transition. So we're not only transitioning to a low emissions future, but we're transitioning to a better, improved low emissions future for everybody. And that's really what Taranaki 2050 was about. And I know many of you in the room have been involved in this process, so thank you very much for all of your participation. And in terms of when we embarked on that process to create the roadmap, we are conscious that we do have the second highest emissions per capita in New Zealand, partly because of the way emissions are recorded and how they're measured, so for example, all of the energy emissions that come from gas are largely captured by us because they're captured at the source, not at the use end. So even though we're supplying gas to the whole country, for example, those emissions are captured against our region. And so when we went about co-designing this vision for 2050, we decided to use a co-creation process around our whole region, focusing on our 7 PO, communities, iwi, local and central government, businesses, educators and unions. And that was to ensure that we've got that great diversity of perspective around the table in all of these conversations. And as many of you know, this is what we came up with. This is our roadmap for 2050. And what that vision articulates is that we want a strong, sustainable environment. We want education options that move and flex with a changing world. That means that there is lifelong learning available to people. We want attractive jobs that are meaningful and well paid. We want a similar lifestyle to the one that many of us enjoy now, but shared by all in our region. We want to lead the way in sustainable low emissions energy, and we want to continue to be and improve on being a region that looks out and cares for itself and its people. Following the development of the roadmap vision, we worked through and developed our 12 transition pathway action plans. So these take that 30-year vision and turn it into a more concrete near-term goals and objectives and actions. So there are 12 of those transition pathway action plans. And all of this is steered by Ngā Aotearoa Taranaki, which is our lead group, to coordinate all the actions and progress across the Taranaki 2050 roadmap, but also Tapuaroa. We've got about 160 actions sitting across those plans, and we're well underway in terms of actions, in terms of progress against all of those actions. And that group of Ngā Aotearoa Taranaki is made up of 13 people representing those 7 po that I talked about just before. So a very brief overview and recap on the roadmap and Tapuaroa. And I'm now going to hand over to Professor Rotmans. So hopefully bear with us as we get this technology to work. Oh, sorry, I did have one more, sorry. Sorry, I forgot my introductory remarks. So in terms of Professor Rotmans, he was a lead member in the Netherlands society-wide process to craft what's called their roadmap for the next economy for Rotterdam, The Hague, which is obviously a region of the Netherlands. And as I mentioned earlier, when we were shaping the concept and process for the Taranaki 2050 roadmap, drew quite significantly from the inspiration from Professor Rotmans' work and the Rotterdam Next Economy work. Also, just to note that the intent with this session is so Professor Rotmans has a presentation, but we do absolutely want this to be an opportunity for some Q&A and discussion. Because we've got a large audience, we're going to be using an app called Slido, which allows us to ensure that as many people as possible get to ask a question and have that answered. So if you would like to, please either download the app or go to the website slido.com. You can join using the code 151891. And please do ask a question at any time throughout the presentation. So as it occurs to you, ask that question, and you can also vote on other people's questions. So if someone has placed a question that you are interested in, that you really want to hear the answer to, please do upvote that question. That just means that when we're trying to collate the questions at the end, we'll put those ones that obviously the most people are interested in to be answered first. So please do use that app. That's going to be a really great way that we can ensure that we're gathering questions from everyone in the room here and also the people who are joining us online. So that code again was just 151891. And a little bit of an introduction to Professor Rotmans. So he's done a lot of work in terms of thinking about transitions to sustainability. So how do we enable and accelerate a shift to a zero carbon, circular, just society and next economy? And he'll explain what he means by some of these terms in his presentation. He's a professor at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He works closely with governments, the OECD, the EU, the UN, industry and the wider public, and he's very passionate about seeing our society and planet flourish. What we are really inspired about with Rotmans as well is that not only is he taking a big picture vision, but he's very much focused on the tangible realities about how we progress. How do we make transitions? How do we make these sustainable? And how do we do these in a way that both embrace a systems perspective and take everyone along on the journey and achieve some better societal outcomes as well as environmental and economic outcomes. So I'm now going to hand over to the professor this time, and hopefully this all works.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much for this kind and nice introduction. It's a bit too much honor, I think. I come from a land, Holland, that used to be sea. I was born and raised 6 meters below sea level. And in 100 years from now, that will be 8 meters below sea level. So the water has been our friend, but also our enemy. So that is throughout the whole history of my country, Holland, is that the core. I have made a presentation for you that I was going to share. And I hope you all can see it. It's called World in Transition. What does it mean to Taranaki? First of all, my compliments. We in Europe and in Holland in particular are a big fan of New Zealand. You also showed leadership during the Corona crisis, also due to your Prime Minister. The female leadership was really a source of inspiration. Jacinda, what's she called? So I will skip that part now, but I will start off with my presentation. It has 5 different blocks. I start off with the level of urgency, then a bit on transitions, then on the roadmap next economy, and then I'm going to reflect on your own roadmap. I think it's a very interesting one. And then I'm mirroring and I show a bit of reflection, what I think could be improved. Anyway, yes, after more than 35 years of my career, I spent on sustainable development, climate change. I did my PhD already more than 30 years ago on climate change. I built the very first integrated climate change model that is still further developed and has been used in all the climate negotiations. And I warned already for what is happening now. What you see in Europe and what we see all over the place in the world is many, many fundamental changes. So I always start off with, we do not live in an era of change, but in a change of era. And a part of that is that we are living in between two eras, and that is characterized by chaos. And chaos has a negative connotation, but also a positive one. If you really want to transform things, you need chaos. Chaos means that the old systems are breaking down and the new ones are emerging. And a system cannot transform without chaos. And the old Greek people celebrated already chaos. And I hope this morning you will celebrate chaos with me. I will explain more on this later on. What we see now in Europe, but also in Siberia, but also in Canada and the US is bushfires. You know it yourself, also in Australia over the last couple of years. The whole world is burning. We in the Netherlands got big floods 2 weeks ago because there was an extreme amount of rainfall. And you see here pictures. It has something to do with climate change. These are all weather extremes that are being reinforced by climate change. You see here how the jet streams, which normally go from west to east, are meandering, as we call it. So they are slowing down. And that means that weather extreme patterns could be caught by these slowing down jet streams. And that basically means in practice that we will be confronted with longer periods of extreme weather. And that might be floods, that might be droughts, but you see it all over the place. Basically, it is part of a pattern. I don't know how you feel, but I feel we are part of a kind of a semi-permanent crisis. And there are 4 different crises I depict in my new book that will come out after summer. There is an economic crisis, an ecological one that arises from the economic crisis. There's a democratic crisis because many people in the world lost their faith in the democracy as we know it, but deep down inside there's a moral crisis. Very briefly, I will treat that because of the strict time the schedule that we have. So the current economy, you all know, is wasteful, polluting, and literally sickening. We still grow at the cost of, we spend money that there isn't, and globalization leads to an increasing gap between the poor and the rich people. So the corona crisis is a symptom of that. We've seen that it deeply impacts on our vital systems like our food system or healthcare, but it really uncovers the system failures that crept into our economy. Everything that we do must be done according to efficiency, short-term return on investments, and every system that is built on these values is running into problems if there is something like a coronavirus. We know that. The deepest cause is the disbalance between us humans and nature and the way we deal with animals. An example, we dig into nature and we are looking for minerals here that we are using in our mobile phones and laptops. And in this place, there used to be nature. We are now confronted with wild animals that carry over these animal diseases like corona. And there is a direct and indirect relation between your mobile phone or laptop and these animal diseases. So the basic message is if we do not really change our behavior, there will come another pandemic with more impact. This we could have foreseen. I work together with some of the worldwide most influential virologists, and they forecasted already 20, 25 years ago that there would come a pandemic. That is related to the ecological crisis because we produce still at the cost of the earth. We borrow natural resources, but we don't pay back. And everybody knows if you use the resources but don't pay back, then you're running into a financial deficit. If you would express that in money terms, the ecological deficit is 35%. And the Anthropocene is the era in which we as humans are definitely impacting the earth and its natural resources. And there are various symptoms of that, climate change, plastic soup, loss of biodiversity, everything that's happening in the oceans. Climate change was my first research topic. Sometimes people say, well, a few degrees more, what matters? But here you see already the difference between half a degree Celsius. 1.5 and 2 degrees makes a significant impact. It is the difference between still having ice at the North Pole or the North Pole ice-free, the coral bleaching or the coral dying. So, will we succeed? If you look at the Paris climate goals in 2015, I was happy to be there in that magnificent meeting in Paris. The chance that we stay below 1.5 degrees is almost zero. The chance that we stay below 2 degrees, it's still possible, but realistically speaking, we are heading for 3 or 4 degrees temperature increase. That means that we are entering the zones of dangerous climate with all its extremities as we know it already. But we should not give up. We need to fight for every 1/10 of a degree. That's the new motto. Every 1/10 of a degree might make a difference. Deep down inside, the crisis in ourselves. You can blame the systems, you can blame neoliberalism, you can blame capitalism, but we all made these systems. A part of us is egoistic and greedy. We always want more and better. So if we would realize that, we would have resolved already 50% of these crises that I described. So the deepest crisis in ourselves. So what I expect is this led already, COVID-19, to a global recession. Climate change will be the next crisis, which will be, let's say, much more disastrous than the COVID-19 crisis. And the biodiversity crisis will even have more impact than the climate crisis. Well, is that an apocalyptic picture? No, I'm still optimistic after all these years, because I think we need those crises in order to change our basic way of thinking and acting. So we stumble from one crisis to the other in the coming decades. That is what we might expect. But in my transition theory, these crises are a blessing in disguise. People are stubborn. Your and my behavior are 90% dependent on ordinary behavior. Real behavioral change you see mostly only during crisis. So these crises facilitate transformative change. So what is usually happening after a systemic crisis like COVID-19 or in the future climate, that 5 or 10% of the people will really change its behavior. The rest, let's say 90%, will go back to business as usual. So apparently we need a series of these crises to really transform. But the good news is the tipping point will not come at 50% of the population, but 25% of the population. That is shown during much of the empirical research that we did in the transition research community. 25% is the tipping point. If you reach 25% of the population that is starting to think and act differently, the remaining 75% can go relatively fast. So the world won't be entirely different after Corona, but definitely it's part of a pattern. And I personally think we are now globally at 15-20% of the people. So one more crisis and we might reach the 25% of the people. That means the tipping point. So that is why we need systemic change. So you have different kinds of change, and you have incremental change, ordinary change, but systemic change means, that means a basic change in the way we think, in the way we act, and the way we organize things. Thinking is basically rooted in our values that we have, our paradigm systems. The acting is in our attitudes and behavior, and organizing is in the laws and the rules, formally and informally, also in our social norms. Well, thinking, acting, and organizing is embedded, as we call it, but most important barrier is the way we think. So that is the ultimate challenge. In systemic terms, I also denote it as fundamental change in structure, culture, and practice. Can you steer that or govern that? Yes and no. No, not in the classical way, not in the command and control way. It's too complex, too uncertain. But what you can try to do is do it in a more organic way, facing the uncertainties and complexity. So what you can do is create innovation spaces for radical innovation, removing barriers like laws or norms, challenge the market and mobilize society, and combine on short-term action and long-term thinking. So we developed this cycle. It's more a spiral, an upwards spiral, creating space for radical innovation, develop a long-term vision, several pathways from now onto that vision, develop an agenda for radical innovation with concrete actions like experiments, learn from that experiments, and create again space for new radical innovation. So it's on and on. In a normal transition process, you go through, let's say, this spiral 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. And we've done it all over the place in more than 20 countries over the last 25 years, 50 cities. There's a rich amount of literature. Within Drift, that's the research institute I established 15 years ago, and at other places. And we have applied it in our hometown, but also across Europe, in Africa, all over the place. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but we learn a lot. We call this organic planning. So that means that transitions require planning, but not classical planning in a command and control atmosphere, but more organic planning with moving targets and continuous adjustment based on what you learn. That is rooted into complex systems theory. That's the end of part one. The second is about the next economy I'm dealing with. There's an old and new economy, you know about it, and the new economy is emerging and growing fastly. It is about the clean economy, a circular, let's say, an economy that is focusing on more than only financial values. Impact is the word now, the impact economy, creating values rather than only deriving values. That has big consequences for multinationals. Tesla wants also to solve the energy problem, like Unilever wants to reduce climate change. But what is Shell doing? Well, I always criticize Shell. I'm now working together with them. They know they need to transform. They are not contributing to climate change. They have serious problems. Last month, there was a big climate juridical case against Shell, a lawsuit that was organized by an NGO and a lawyer, Roger Cox, who also did the lawsuit against the state of the Netherlands on behalf of Urgenda that I once established, Urgent Agenda. And we won against the state of the Netherlands, and we won against Shell as well. That means that Shell needs to reduce its emissions by 45% in the next 9 years. That is huge. And it has large implications for all other fossil multinationals all over the world. By the way, there are now almost 2,000 climate cases worldwide. So lawsuits against multinationals, against states, against regions. So Shell in the future needs to phase out gas and oil in 20 years, needs to build up sustainable energy in 20 years, and needs to show leadership, focusing on things like green hydrogen. But that requires a complete shift in culture and structure. Another aspect of the old economy and the new one is the digitization and the digital platforms. You see here at the right side a number of examples, and some of these examples still represent the old capitalistic economy, but nevertheless they are quite disruptive. That's the reason why I mentioned them. Disruption means fundamentally changing the markets and the companies themselves. And you have disruptive innovations, technologies, and companies. I give you only 2 examples with an eye on the time, but you have about 10 of these disruptive technologies and innovations, from 3D printing, blockchain, to the Internet of Things. It fundamentally changes both our economy, but also our lifestyle. Uber. I hate this company, the way they deal with their employees, but they are very disruptive. They simply connect drivers to passengers. It's the largest taxi company in the world, but it has no taxis, no possession. And it disrupts the whole transport chain because you cannot do it more simple and easier and cheaper. And within 5 years, there's an Uber for the building sector. There will be an Uber for the care sector. There will be an Uber for any kind of sector. The second example is blockchain in the port of Rotterdam. A transport now from Shanghai to Rotterdam that will take 4, 5, 6 weeks sometimes of containers, and you might do it easier, faster, cheaper if you use blockchain. You know any kind of moment, any second where the load is. So that means that all the redundant links in that chain, because sometimes 15 different companies are engaged in this chain, they will all disappear only the parties that create value will remain. This is a 3D printer. You also have a 4D printer that can print itself. But the first houses are already printed in the Netherlands, where people live already. Well, they may look like a bit odd, but that's a matter of time. I work together with Ikea. Ikea is changing fundamentally its business model. They consider waste as a resource, as a source of income. That means that they will, in the near future, remain the producer of their own resources. They will be responsible for the resources. Face the situation that in 10 years from now, you will not buy any furniture from Ikea, but you will rent it for a specific period or lease it. And after a few years, you give it back. You give it back to Ikea and they make other things out of it. So that means that they will become the supplier and processor of resources. And they see any kind of product as a collection of reusable resources. And that underlines the transition from possess things to use things. Why would you own a lamp? You will use the function of lighting. So they are already experimenting in the Netherlands with thousands of students who can lease things from Ikea and give it back after a few years. That's a fundamentally new economy. We frame this most in terms of the return on investments. So basically formulated, every dollar that you invest in the new economy will yield you $3 return on investment in terms of yielding innovation, employment, many jobs will be created, and building up a new economic structure. But every dollar that you invest in the old economy will cost you $3 because of the increasing pollution, contribution to climate change, and the negative health impacts. There's hardly any time to address this, but very briefly, next to the next economy, there will be a new society. In the old one we are still living in, we live in a top-down, centralized society based on silos that are rooted in the 19th century, the industrial era. Now we are building up a more bottom-up, decentralized, personalized society, which is community-based. Very important. That means that the social sectors, as we know them, will be transformed in the next decades. The labor market will be transformed, our pension system, health and education, even our democracy will be transformed. These systems have functioned quite well over the last 100 years, but over the last 20 years, they become dysfunctional because the world has changed, we as humans have changed. Personalized is the new word. Not any longer utilitarian, reasoning from the collective, but personalized. The third issue is about the roadmap next economy I've worked on over the last couple of years together with Jeremy Rifkin, who is a pioneer in the field of digitization. It was a quest for us. We didn't know where we would end, and it was a kind of a journey, and more people joined that. We asked ourselves 4 key questions. First, where do we earn our money with in 20 years from now? Second, how will the labor market develop in our region? Third, what kind of skills do we need for the next economy? And fourth, how many and what kind of investments are needed? We couldn't address all these questions accurately, but we tried to do our best. I come back to that in a few minutes. We were organized as a kind of an organism, as a tribe. I was part of the core group, a couple of bureaucrats, 1 scientist and an entrepreneur. There were teams around different thematic teams like the energy transition, resources, digitization. I will show you. There was a strategy group and a bunch of followers. So basically we created an organism, self-steering for various teams. And we had 5 transition themes or pathways. First, digitization. We wanted to become a smart digital delta. Secondly, to become smart in terms of energy. Thirdly, building up a circular economy. Fourthly, become more entrepreneurial. And fifth, building up a next more inclusive society. Our vision was a bit similar to yours. We are also heavily fossil fuel based, also because of our port, which is still driven by carbon, oil and gas. You also have a fossil fuel based industry part here. So we wanted in 30 years to become zero carbon, zero waste, circular, digitally connected. That's the hardware, and the software we mentioned more entrepreneurial, smarter and inclusive. We continuously try to combine the vision with the strategy and the action. So we spend a lot of time on alignment between the 5 transition pathways I show you, and to become very, very concrete with breakthrough projects. So that means that there's a lot of attention for cross-cutting developments, cross-cutting themes. We stayed away from the sector-based approach because I think in the new economy, many of the sectors will not survive, and new kind of intersectors will emerge. So here is an example of how we created intersections between the digitization and becoming smart in energy terms, and between becoming fully circular and digital and smart energy. So, well, I cannot go into detail. It's all documented. We created a bunch of breakthrough projects. I'm going to show you some example. First of all, an energy delivering road. So energy producing, you see here the, let's say, solar panels on the front walls that produce energy that are used for the whole road. There are 17 innovations, most of them in terms of digitization. It's also a smart road. We are now expanding. There are more roads built that produce energy that is not so complicated to do that. This is what we call Platoon trucking. So trucks are digitally connected. And what you see is transport from our port to Germany and other countries. Not truck by truck, but in a series of trucks, which are digitally steered now. That saves you about 20-25% of CO2. So that has a couple of advantages. We are working on a next generation of urban areas in terms of living and healthcare, social communities, mobility. We are decoupling houses from natural gas. That's quite disruptive, but we decided in Netherlands to stop with natural gas. So that means 7.5 million houses without natural gas the coming 20-25 years. That is a huge endeavor. We transformed old industrial, buildings like this. We used to build ships here. And now these are, let's say, places where we educate young people, but also practice them with elements of the new economy. And there are companies alongside this. So this is about learning by doing and doing by learning. It's about becoming entrepreneurial. So new forms of education together with companies. We are transforming old harbor areas into entrepreneurial areas, maker districts. We are starting with building on water because we want to move with the rising tide. We cannot fight only against the water because we will lose that. Quite a number of funny examples here, like swimming pools underwater, like houses. We even have a floating farm with cows on the water. We are building a green hydrogen factory. Here you see that. But we need to realize that we cannot become autonomous. That also holds for New Zealand. Most of the hydrogen we need to import. What you see in terms of blue is where the hydrogen will be produced. In those areas where they have deserts, a lot of place for wind and solar energy. You see Australia, you see North Africa, you see Latin America, Canada. And here you see in red where the demand comes from. So what you see is a global play that is focusing on green hydrogen, and that basically follows the lines where we see now the oil and gas is coming from. So there will be a huge power play in the next decades unfolding around hydrogen. We in Europe can produce at most 30, 40, 50% of the green hydrogen. The rest we need to import. And I think that also holds for New Zealand. There's a lot of place on the water where you can use solar panels for. What are the lessons that we've learned from our roadmap? Well, first of all, if you look at innovation, where the focus is mostly on technology and technical innovation, 75% of the innovation is due to social innovation and 25% due to technical innovation. That means we should focus more on development of competences, making people smarter, organizing ourselves in a more flexible, dynamic way, becoming more agile, doing things in co-creation, co-production. So the software, the people, are at least as important as the hardware. What you also see is that you need a diversity of impulses. Of course, you need money, but you also need to transform existing laws. You also need to change your institutional palette and ecosystem, and also the mindset is important to be transformed. For instance, in the Netherlands, we had 20 juridical barriers for the new economy. There is still a barrier, a law that prohibits you to reuse waste. That is now ridiculous, but 40, 50 years ago, when the law was made, it was logical. Because at that time, waste was seen as harmful for the environment. Financial impulses, the money is not the problem, there's plenty of. The problem is to get the money to the right places. Investing in risky breakthrough projects. Mental impulse, well, a major barrier that I've noticed is our mental barrier. We can hardly imagine how different our economy and society will become in the future. So there's a lack of imagination among many people. I also learned that although it is needed to engage many people, the really breakthroughs come from breakthrough coalitions. So we focused on the coalition of the willing and the able. Don't try to get everyone on board, because then the pace is determined by the slowest and not by the fastest. Why is that? Well, in general, I've learned the following. If you look within a region or a company or a country, 10% of the people is willing to change and can change, not more than that. Those are the front runners. Then there's 25% who is willing to change but cannot change. Then there's 25% who can change but is not willing to. And the remaining 40% is not willing and cannot change. So if you get them on board, then they become the laggards and they will slow down the process of transition. The role of the government is important in these processes. In the first place, they are initiating and have a directing role, but later on, it's becoming a more facilitating role. That means giving direction and providing space. Then the process is usually taken over by citizens and, let's say, society and business companies. It is very important to frame it in the most attractive way. So we have calculated roughly that the transition in our region yields 200,000 jobs per year. the next 25 years. We will also be losing jobs, let's say about 50, 60,000 due to breaking down the old economy. But net, that means a gain of 150,000 jobs per year. In particular for those who are living in the poor districts. So there are many, many emerging startups and scale-ups that form an ecosystem. And most of this work is clean work with high wages that can be very, very attractive for young people. Well, I've read the Taranaki roadmap and other documents, and I'm going to reflect on this the next couple of minutes. First of all, my compliments. I was really impressed by what I've read and what I've seen. Look at this beautiful picture as a result of co-creation where many people were involved. Very creative, very inspiring. Kids involved. We didn't. I know how difficult it is, but it's really crucial to get them on board. So really, really inspiring. It's ambitious, but realistic. It's well thought out. Many, many stakeholders involved. It breeds optimism. I really, really liked it. But if I only would give compliments, this would become a boring meeting. So I won't do that. So I give, let's say, in a mild form, my reflection. First of all, I think the roadmap as it is now is a bit technocratic. The overall goal is to shape a low emission future. That's not something where my children or my mom would become really enthusiastic about. I would love it to be framed in a more broad way. We are going to build a new society and a new economy that's clean, that's healthy, that's inclusive, but low emissions, it's a bit technocratic. I also think it's too much oriented towards climate change and reducing sector by sector of CO2 emissions. You can build a low carbon economy, but still not being circular. Building up a circular economy is completely different in terms of design, in terms of production process, than a low carbon economy. So be aware of that. So the transition to a new economy is not equivalent to a low carbon economy. My second point is I miss a bit the how. How was the process designed? How are you going to maintain this? The first 2 years are always relatively easy. There's a lot of energy and spirit, and many people like the process of initiation and creation. But then it becomes more difficult. There's resistance from those who could be in danger, like the fossil fuel regime. There are always front runners, but there is the peloton and there are the laggards. And if you include all of them, then the pace is determined by not the front runners, but by the laggards. And I think that the pace should be determined by the front runners. So don't try to engage everybody. Focus on a coalition of the willing and the able. If you will get the fossil fuel industry on board, then you will get money from them, but they will also have an impact on the agenda. And my experience over all these years is that they will slow down the process. And they won't go too fast. That's not in their own interest. Third reflection, I miss a little bit the multi-sectoral approach and the cross-cutting themes. In our roadmap, digitization was really, really important because that affects the energy transition and the circular transition. Circularity is also key to the new economy. I missed that a bit, and education and becoming inclusive is also key. And the focus on social innovation rather than technological innovation. So don't focus on the sectoral approach, I think, but try to address the cross-sectoral themes, because in a new economy, we won't find all those pillars. The current pillars that we face in the old economy, they are rooted in a 19th century, like transport and energy and industry and chemistry. That's all silo-based thinking. And in a new economy, it will be more horizontal. Fourth reflection, I miss a little bit the multi-actor approach. So the number of actors is not key, I think, but the type of actors. Do you have the real influencers on board? The real people with social networks, the real ambassadors. So if you have the right people on board with the good social networks and influencers, the roadmap might spread like a virus. In particular for young people below 30 or 40, this is crucial. So the social psychological aspect of a roadmap is at least as important as the technological aspect. So engage those actors who could spread the vision and approach like a virus. I think that's very important. The fifth one, I miss a little bit the learning process. For us, this has been a learning by doing and doing by learning. We didn't know what we started at the beginning. We've made a lot of mistakes, we've made failures, but we learned an awful lot of that. So we try to register everything that we are learning. You learn most from your failures. So try to politicize the roadmap process and make it society-driven and business-driven. My experience is if this roadmap comes into the hands of politicians, then this might be the end of the process, because they are really pragmatic and they sometimes move after 4 years. They're very opportunistic, and you need to become more or less autonomous and not dependent on that. Although you need to engage them in a way that they support it, but not lead it. So that's what I mean with depolitizing. My last reflection is I miss a little bit the evolutionary approach. For us, a transition is an evolutionary revolution. So that means it is a radical outcome, but in small incremental steps. So I would formulate intermediate steps for the next 10 years, the next 20 years, and also formulate concrete goals for the next 10, 20 years. So I would make the process as concrete as possible. It's a bit abstract now, and also with more concrete, tangible goals and intermediate results. That helps. Everybody agrees on the next 30 years because it's far away and quite abstract, but not over the next 10 years. Then the tensions pop up, and then it becomes already more controversial. And my experience is also that it helps in order to frame the process in social and economic gains. So we presented this in a way that we said, okay, it will create many, many jobs. They will get jobs lost, but we will create way more jobs than in the old economy. It will really contribute to innovation and a more inclusive economy and society. So how many jobs will you create in 10 years from now? And in 20 years from now? How many Maori people could be employed? Because in our roadmap, let's say the young people from the poor districts, they had the big chance to, let's say, get a job in the new economy. Breakthrough projects are important in order to keep the energy in the process as high as possible. Well, to round off, and then I'm open to any kind of question. You may be proud of yourself because Taranaki is a front runner in New Zealand, and you know that. I didn't come across many of these well thought roadmaps as I've studied over the last couple of days. So please be proud of yourself. And I always end with this statement. Everybody told me it was impossible already when I started 35 years ago, until somebody stepped by who didn't know that. And that was me today. Thank you very much for your attention. And now the floor is open to any kind of question.
We're unmuted. Thank you very much, Jan. That was fantastic presentation and lots of food for thought in there, I think, for all of us. We do have some Q&A that have come through in the app. And so, Jan, perhaps if you're able to check the Q&A in front of you and hopefully answer some of these questions.
Yeah, first question is about what constitutes a key behavioral change. Very good, difficult question. To give an indication, social norms play a key role in, let's say, behavioral change. And that is underrated in, let's say, the mindset of many people. Example, I studied the transition from smoking to non-smoking that started about 50 years ago. 50 years ago, 90% of the adult people smoked all over the place in Europe, but I guess also in New Zealand and Australia. And that changed in 2 generations. First, a small group of people stopped with smoking because they read about the negative health impacts. They influenced a larger group, and then a large group of people stopped after 20-25 years because it was not considered anymore as social and, let's say, well, being a kind of a hero. But after 25 years, people realized how damaging smoking could be. And only then, after 30 years, the government came with restrictions, came with new laws in order to prohibit smoking in buildings, in working places, in restaurants. Many people think that it was steered by the government, but that's not true. If you are now smoking, you are a bit of a loser. With all respect for you that still smoke, but the social norms fundamentally changed over the past 2 generations. And you see now the same with regard to food. If you will eat in 10 or 50 years from now, such a horrible fast food hamburger from McDonald's, then you will also turn into a loser. If you won't have solar panels in 10 or 50 years from now, you will also be a loser. So that is really a driving force behind many of the transitions that we see. And people, those key influencers who have an impact on the social norms, they play a crucial role in transitions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jan. I think there should be another question in there for you.
Yes. This is about the real power of Taranaki 2050. It was in the empowering participatory process. How can we have more deliberate and direct democratic communities? Well, that is a very good point. Because what we are doing now in our roadmap, we started a bit more in a top-down mode in order to make it really radical and creative and innovative. And we are now doing a co-creation process by entering neighborhoods, in particular the poorer neighborhoods, and further develop it with them, with these communities. So I really think it needs to be more community-based, and that touches upon a failure in our current democratic system, because many people have lost their faith in the current democratic system. I see that all over the place, in particular in the poorer districts in our cities and regions. These people do not feel heard. They don't have a say. They feel ignored. In my vision that I created for the next 100 years in my new book, I think we are going to build a democratic system, which is more locally based, with, let's say, more autonomous rights for local people, like we used to have in the old Greek days. So autonomous communities at the local level, then regions. I think many of the countries, the states will disappear. The states occurred in the 19th century in Europe and many other continents. But I think the states will disappear, because if you are building up a new economy, it will be circular, and let's say the best suitable geographic form for a circular economy is a region. Much more natural than a country which is artificially bounded anyhow. And then you have the international level. So it will be a combination of local, regional, international. And I think your roadmap can be only a success if it is rooted in, let's say, those communities.
Thanks, Jan. There's a third question there.
Yes, I see. New Zealand is importing huge amounts of coal from Indonesia. Have we tried to transition too soon, and could we have worked closer with the industry to avoid this? Yeah, coal is, what we see all over the world is that we are phasing out coal. We are closing down now our coal-fired plants in the Netherlands, and many other countries in Europe do that. Unfortunately, China not. But they had plans to build 1,000 new coal-fired plants, and they abandoned that. So they left that coal pathway. I know that Australia is still largely using it, you too, apparently. I think it's a dead end. You cannot earn money anymore with it. It cannot compete with renewable energy anymore. Don't forget that we are producing now solar energy for 1 or 2 cents per kilowatt hour already in the Middle East, and in my country for 3-4 cents per kilowatt hour. And the same holds for wind energy. So coal is a dead end and very damaging. And in face of the urgency that I showed you, you should stop within 2, 3, 4 years with this. That's really a shame, I think. That is the old economy.
It's a challenge for us as our energy infrastructure, the rest of our energy infrastructure comes up to speed. Yeah. Next question, Jan.
I don't get a next.
Should be
open. Perhaps I see.
Yeah.
Sorry. Susan Krumdick, the founder of Transition Engineering, convincingly argues against green hydrogen. Instead, we need to downshift energy use. Comments, please. Aha, good point. Well, in my new book, I describe 10 different transitions. So the energy transition, the resources, the circular transition, the democratic transition, the education, the healthcare, what have you. In all transitions, I come down to the conclusion that we need to reduce our energy use. You can never build up a circular economy if we do not downshift our energy use. So I wholeheartedly agree with that. That's one. Second, I don't see, to be frank, and I said it earlier this morning in a dialogue I had with a high-level commission, I don't see how we can replace oil and natural gas without green hydrogen. There are basically, if you look at the oil industry, if you look at the fossil fuel industry in general, like the steel industry, there are basically three ways in which you can replace oil and gas. You can focus on electricity that goes up to 1000 degrees. You cannot go beyond it. It's expensive, but you can do it. Or biomass, that's controversial, or green hydrogen. The best chances I see, and I see Shell is now hugely investing in it, other oil companies as well. The best available option is green hydrogen. But I also said this morning, if you want to invest in green hydrogen, you need to accelerate the demand and supply. There's hardly any demand and supply for green hydrogen. It's simply too costly now. It's too expensive. It cannot compete with natural gas. That means that you need to invest in blue hydrogen. That means producing hydrogen out of gas, but then storing the CO2 emitted under the ground. So carbon capture storage. I heard this morning that your government is basically against carbon capture storage. I think that's a mistake. I was frankly also against CCS, but a couple of years ago, I changed my mind because I see no alternative for green hydrogen. And if you want to build a green hydrogen in the amount of mass and volumes that we need, you need to invest in carbon capture storage. And that is the path that we in Europe are going to take. The disadvantage is that it makes you dependent on other countries. And I think that you in New Zealand needs to heavily invest in wind at sea and also solar at sea. You can, in the vision that we created for the Netherlands, most of the wind and solar energy comes from the sea, the North Sea. That's 2 times the surface that we have on land. And I think 70–80% of the future wind and solar energy comes from the water. And I think if New Zealand is not going to use the water, I don't see how you can reach the climate and sustainability goals, to be frank. I realize that's a bit controversial and that is quite a statement, but yeah, that's how I see it this moment.
Thank you. Jan, there's another,
Yes.
question about behavior change. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on behavior change regarding our food systems trends and the link of this to climate change? Yes, well, we know that one of the major drivers behind climate change is the food system. We in Europe are guilty, and the Netherlands in particular. I'm ashamed of that. We are the second largest food producer in the world after the United States. Why? Because we have such a high intensity. So we do it in a highly efficient, highly intense way. That means we produce an enormous amount of food out of 1 hectare. And that means that we use a lot of manure, a lot of pesticides, a lot of feed that we import from far away, like Latin America. And that is a shame because it has a large ecological footprint. And there is a huge discussion in my country to transform that the next 20 years. And there's a huge protest from the farmers. But the whole idea is that we reduce 50% of the agricultural area. And to make out of this nature and different forms of biomass that we can use for the bio-based economy. So we are going to transform then from producing crops to, let's say, different types of biomass like humus and miscanthus, and we can use that in the building sector, in the chemistry. What we better can do is export our knowledge to other regions. and help them in order to build up their own sustainable farming systems. We as humans can put a lot of pressure on this agricultural system. Why? I told you, because of the changing social norms. And that is a crucial role. If we would stop the next couple of years consuming those awful products from Burger King, McDonald's, and so forth and so on, then we could create that huge shift. People always tell me, I am willing to change, but the system is holding off and the system is against it. But we are the system. We have made those systems. We have the transformative power to change these systems. Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever, has said once, a bunch of consumers can lay down Unilever within a few seconds. But we all underestimate the collective power that we have. I call that in my new book, the illusion of being powerless. We have way more potential power than we realize, but we don't use it. But see how we are using it in climate change. 2 years ago, 6 million young people went onto the street and they were protesting against failing climate policies. I think within a couple of years, we will do the same, but then protesting against the agricultural system, which is really, really, let's say, the biggest contributor to climate change.
Thanks, Jan. I think it's definitely an interesting perspective for us as Taranaki, because food and fibre sector is one of our largest sectors, but obviously New Zealand has quite a different agricultural system in terms of intensity, which is valuable. So another question up there for you, Jan, in terms of our Indigenous population and some of the practices, and how could we embed that or share that further?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you have more experience than we, because we lost already that natural link with indigenous people in Europe. And you can profit from it. I already denoted in my lecture that the deepest cause that brought us into these systemic crises was the disbalance between ourselves and nature. If you look at the Corona crisis, you see that we can still learn a lot from nature. Our social systems and our economic systems are not resilient. They are not, let's say, adaptive enough to withstand a crisis like Corona, let alone a climate crisis or a nature crisis. Nature is not only built on efficiency or return on investment in the short term. So nature is much more resilient and much more adaptive, and we can learn an awful lot of that. And so my vision for the next 100 years is called, let's say, a new balance that we create between humans and nature. And then we can learn a lot from the informal knowledge and the wisdom of indigenous people. So I think you are in the right position and on the lucky side. You are part of a revolution. And that is my point. We need to celebrate that this morning, because there are not so many generations who are part of a revolution. And if you can use the wisdom of indigenous people, yeah, I feel a bit jealous then, in the sense that we couldn't in the Netherlands or in Europe. We have lost that already. And but there's a whole discussion in Europe and in my country about becoming more inclusive, more diverse, and giving a better voice to the different cultures there are around. To give an indication, in the region I'm working in, there are 190 different cultures from different ethnical background, 190. And I think in our roadmap, only 5 of them are practically used. So I would start with education and let's say, yeah, attracting young people in this process, making it as diverse as possible, and go back to the roots, back to the future, I sometimes call it. Everything that we are going to make and build should be natural based. And then you come automatically back to these indigenous people and wisdom.
Yeah, we've just got time probably for one more question.
One more.
Yeah, so one here about how you go about being an energy roadmap influencer with credibility when still on a journey to learn and understand yourself.
How do you get about being an energy roadmap influencer? Well, don't forget that those influences mostly come from different fields. So we invited people from culture, from arts, and I saw in your approach that's also a part. Musicians, pop stars, so people from completely different fields. So what I meant with influencer is not that you are an expert. We have more than enough energy experts. You will probably have more than enough of that. But that's not where we are looking for. We are looking for people from completely different fields who say, this is a good idea, I support it, and I try to live according to these principles, because it is important that you are authentic. If you are not authentic as an influencer, well, you will be blown away by the social media. But authentic influencers who embrace the principles of the roadmap and try to live according to these principles, I think, yeah, 5 of them could make a difference. There was a television documentary I was part of a few years ago, and I said 5 of those influencers, change agents, and we can cause a revolution in my country. And I think that's true. Again, we are underestimating the potential power that these people have. And those influencers have social networks around them by which it is possible to spread these messages in a very fast way. So I'm more and more interested in the social tipping points than in the physical tipping points. So again, the software is at least as important as the hardware. So as a mathematician, I've spent 35 years on complex systems, and now I realize that the most complex systems are humans themselves. So I ended up now with a conclusion that humans are the beginning and the end of successful transitions. And my son of 24 says, well, couldn't you have invented that earlier? That is a kind of trivial, he said. And he's right, perhaps, but everybody has his own way. So, yeah. Anyway, the last to round off, have you given this talk to central government in Wellington? No, that is on the agenda, as far as I know, for next week. So I give a couple of lectures next Wednesday and then the week after 3. So I try to do what I can. I was planning to visit your country already 1.5 years ago, but Corona messed it up. And I was also planning to have a holiday in New Zealand. Well, that will come once, because we love your country. What a beautiful country you have. And it was a pleasure for me to be with you. And I missed you because I can hardly see you.
Yes.
But sometimes I hear you, and I still hope there was a kind of intense contact, because it has its limitations, this digital form. But well, I try to do what is possible, and well, there's a lot of people with a lot of transition knowledge all over the place that could be helpful for you. So and if you want to know more, I'm more than happy to answer your written questions. Send me those by emails and I will take them up.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Professor. We can give him a round of applause. I will just ask, Conrad, can you come up again, sorry, and help me with, I don't want to break the system by trying to switch back, but just, yeah, that was a great note to finish on, Jan, I think, in terms of the fact that ultimately it all rests with us as people in terms of how we progress on this journey and ensure that we have a successful transition to that new future that our region has painted in our roadmap. In terms of just a couple of things I wanted to note. So yes, Professor Jan Rotmans is going to undertake some other engagements in New Zealand. So this is actually something that a guy called Dave Henley and I have been, as Jan mentioned, working on for sort of about 18 months, 2 years. We got disrupted by Corona because, as I said, originally we were looking at bringing out the professor in person, which obviously would have been amazing. And then we've since been working on, you know, building this kind of approach instead, so that we weren't, I guess, potentially waiting 3 or 4 years before we could see Jan in person. But in terms of the other engagements, yes, he's going to be engaging with government agencies and also potentially with some ministers and through the Dutch embassy. So yes, these conversations are going wider, but in Taranaki we've been very privileged to have the special time with Jan because of our work on the roadmap. And I would in particular like to thank the Toy Foundation for enabling this to happen. So thank you, Maria. Also thanks to MB who have sponsored this overall series as well alongside Toy, and as a big thank you to my colleague or collaborator on this, Dave Henley, and also a huge thank you to Conrad and our team at VT who's worked tirelessly to help pull this whole series together alongside Dave. So and thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your engagement in the Q&A. Apologies that we didn't get through all of the Q&A that were on the app, but we're very happy to talk with anyone further. So very happy to go, sorry. Yeah, very happy to have further conversations with anyone about the roadmap and our journey and all the actions that are in train through the action plans, etc. And we'll just close with our karakia. Again, please feel free to join in. Unihia, unihia, unihia ki te uru tapunui, kia wātea, kia māma, te tenako, te tinana, te wairoa I te ara takatu. Ko ia rā e rongo whakarea ake ki ronga, kia wātea, aira, kua wātea, au, pai mārere. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your day.